Hi everybody, good afternoon. How's it going? Good morning if you're over there across the pond. Hope you're doing good. I hope you're having a good day, a good morning. Hope you had good coffee. My name is Zuko, and as you already know, I'm a student of religion and human medicine. At the end of this video, actually even now, if you could subscribe to my channel or give me a like, that would be nice. It's not a fancy channel, but it's where you're going to learn some important things regarding the Bible for now and faith and the universe. And then we'll get into other interesting things that have to do with lifestyle in the future. But to help me grow my channel, would you please be so kind as to subscribe and then click the like button at the end, or even now? Today, I want to talk about approaches to faith. Okay, there's a very, very different approach to faith between the peoples of the world. Okay. But when we're talking about the peoples of the world, I'm going to divide them in this video into East and West, okay? East and West. There's a different approach to God in the East and the West. For example, in the West, there's skepticism, there's imagination, there are fairy tales, there are pantheons, there are champions, there are gods, there are spirits, and also there is superstition. In the East, we can see that there's trust, there's knowledge, there's an experience with God, and then the spin-off is knowledge. Knowledge is teaching, teaching is writing, writing is a compilation of books. That's how we end up with the Bible, Biblios in Greek, a compilation of revelations that have come to people because of their first-hand experience with God. So people in the West, when they come to God, or when they come to the Bible specifically, which is an Eastern book, they are largely exposed to a translation. And so people in the West build doctrines and faith and belief based on a translation. People in the East are reading the original text, and therefore there is a difference, a vast difference of how they approach God compared to the people in the West. For example, the word faith, emuna. The word faith does not exist anywhere in the Hebrew scriptures because faith is a translation of emuna, and the word emuna means trust. So how do you gain trust? You gain trust because you've come to know someone, and when you've come to know someone, you collect information about them, you have an experience with them, and you come to trust them. Indeed, the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures, they tell us to have trust, to know God first, and then to develop a trust in God. And let me just share my whole screen, actually. Here we are. So in the West, you must have faith because the basis of knowledge is skepticism. The basis of trust is skepticism in the West. In the East, it's about experience. Let's look at the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers 16, verses 28. It says, "And Moses said, by this you shall know that it was God who sent me to you, who sent me to do all these things, that they are not of my own devising." Exodus 7, verses 17, "Thus saith God, by this you shall know that I am God. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod, and that this is a rod that is in my hand, and it will turn into blood." Numbers 16, verses 30, "But if God brings about something unheard of, so that the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and then go down into Sheol, you shall know that those involved have spurned God." And it says here, as Exodus 16, verses 6, "And Moses said to Aharon, uh, to the and Moses and Aharon said to the Israelites, by evening you shall know it was God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So immediately here, we get the feeling or the sense that when you come to God, you must have the knowledge of God. You can look at the Ten Commandments. Nowhere does it say you must believe in God. You can look at the whole Testament. There is nowhere where God says you must believe. It says, rather, God says you must get to know me, so that if you get to know me, you will have information, experience, first-hand experience, and if you are serious about this relationship, you might even produce trust, or the relationship might even produce trust. Let's look at a very interesting verse here in Psalm chapter 14. Let me share my screen again quickly. Psalm chapter 14. We have here a Psalm, verse 1. It says, "For the leader of David, the benighted man thinks God does not care. Man's deeds are corrupt and loathsome. No one does good." All right, so what happens is once you know God and you have information about God, that's called oral tradition. It's an oral tradition because you have a knowledge that is oral. In the West, people have been taught when they read the New Testament, especially, that wherever there's oral law, it's not biblical material. They shouldn't care about oral law. They should only read what is written. There's a problem with this because once you have knowledge of something, you immediately write it down. Even in science, you sit, you observe, you see, you think, and then you write what you see. So everything begins in the mind and it becomes oral, and then you write it down. The same thing with biblical material. So if you don't like oral law, oral tradition, don't read the Bible at all, because the Bible is written, but it is from oral law, and then it is also interpreted by oral law. What do I mean by this? Let's look at this verse. Let's start from here. It says, uh, foolish or benighted in his heart, the man who says God is not there. It says here, which is the translation which uses oral tradition to interpret. It says, "For the leader of David, the benighted man, thinks God doesn't care." In the text, it says Ein Elohim, which means God is not there. But the interpretation orally that's written here as a translation says God does not care. So God does not care is the meaning of this Ein Elohim. If you come from the West and you see it in the Christian Bible here, let's take a typical Christian Bible version, which is the ESV, okay? Actually, let's look at the King James, because the Christians swear by the King James, but the King James is the most corrupted Bible version in the world, maybe second to the Good News. It says here, "To the musician, a psalm of David, the fool hath said in his heart, there's no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good." So if you're a Westerner and your mindset is that you must study the text, forgetting that the text is a translation, then you can have yourself a false teaching by teaching people that it is idiotic, you're a fool to believe in God. Another approach to faith in the West is shaming people. In the West, people are shamed to believe something, not even God. You're shamed to believe science, because if you don't believe science, you are foolish, you're backwards. You are shamed to accept many persuasions, you are shamed into a cult to conform to culture. So in the West, people are shamed into action. Yet in the Eastern culture, people are persuaded by information, first-hand experience, and also trust. In the West, you have to be shamed into something to believe. If you don't believe, you have no faith. And therefore, as I said, faith is not in the Bible. To believe, we are not asked. The Bible doesn't ask us to believe, it asks us to trust. In this particular verse, if you read it from Western perspective, it tells you that you're an idiot if you don't believe in God. If you read in the Hebrew Bible, you get to understand that if you don't believe in God, or rather, if you don't trust that God exists, you could be in the dark. You could be a benighted man. You could be in the dark. But this verse in Psalm 14 is not talking about belief in God. This verse is talking about when you are in trouble, When things are going wrong in your life, you decide that God doesn't care about your problems. This is your foolishness. This is when you are benighted because you think he doesn't care, right? And then when God gets you out of this problem, you're like, oh, well, I made it anyway because I'm resilient. But in actual fact, if you trusted God during your difficult time, you would be able to acknowledge that God is there and he helps us through the difficult times. So what does this verse reveal in its nature? It reveals that in the world, there are a lot of people who are missing out on opportunities of enlightenment because they don't have trust. Unfortunately, in the Western world, skepticism is the basis for gnosis and faith, is a basis for knowledge and faith. You distrust something before you get bowled over by it. Skepticism, that's the enemy of trust. And so when you're looking at biblical material such as the New Testament that has made it into the hands of the Western people, this is why the New Testament is interpreted in such an incorrect way, and the wrong, incorrect story has been taken into the world. It is simply because of the interpretation. Because an Eastern book with Eastern writing that has its own interpretation in oral tradition has been translated without taking into account oral tradition into a Western language. And the Western people are taught from a book an incomplete story because the oral tradition to interpret that story is not present. And that's why you have in the church 40,000 or 50,000 denominations, because all these denominations have been given a New Testament that is based on a Western interpretation that forgoes the tradition of oral and written tradition of the Jewish people. And therefore their meaning and extrapolation is always wrong. They don't agree, the Westerners among themselves, and they've been divided into 50,000 church denominations. Well, in future videos, we're going to start learning the Bible. I just wanted to touch on this belief issue and the different ways of looking at and interpreting the Bible. We're going to be talking about God, his existence that many people deny because of skepticism in the West. And we're going to talk about what God says as people in the East have trust in the scriptures, because the scriptures they didn't fall from the sky, they came from oral tradition. So both oral and written tradition is going to be telling us from the next video exactly what's going on in God's world. And also it will determine whether faith makes sense or trust. I know it was a little bit of a vague video, but it's an important one because it clears the way for what we are going to be studying, beginning from Genesis 1, verses 1